Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome to today's Mark Samuelin Distinguished Speaker Series conversation with General David Petraeus on the evolution of warfare from 1945 until Ukraine. My name is Aaron Rosen, and I have the pleasure to serve as the President of the World Affairs Council of Miami. We are an independent, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization and a proud member of the National World Affairs Councils of America network. Perhaps most importantly, we are a community-serving organization working to enhance local access to high-quality information on international affairs topics. I'd like to briefly recognize and express my appreciation for the board members here in attendance. I see Patrick, Nathan, Nick. Not sure if there's anybody else I missed, but thank you for joining us. I'd also like to give a tremendous thanks to our partners, Miami Dade College Wolfson Campus and Miami Dade College Honors College, without whom these events would not be possible. Thank you for your trust and support. Today's conversation will be informed by the book you saw and hopefully purchased and got signed outside, Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. It was co-authored by General Petraeus and the renowned British military historian, Lord Andrew Roberts. Lord Roberts had planned to join us here today, but unfortunately will not be able to make it. We are, however, highly fortunate to have with us here General Petraeus, one of the world's foremost thinkers on warfare, leadership, and strategy. Against the backdrop of escalating geopolitical tensions, precarious regional conflicts, and a frustratingly complex international landscape, we hold today's conversation with an unyielding dedication to better understand the complexities of our world. This conversation will look into the historical, strategic, humanitarian, technological, unconventional, and future aspects of warfare. In short, it will be a deep dive and will take place with renewed urgency. While the precise statistics can be debated, it is clear that in 2022 and 2023, we saw a drastic and worrisome increase in military conflict around the world. We are therefore grateful for the General's participation here today to examine warfare's evolution and explore what must be learned from the past, as well as anticipated for the future, in order for our country and us as citizens to better navigate this world. In a few short moments, it will be my honor to moderate today's conversation. Before we begin, however, I'd like to remind the audience to hold all questions until the Q&A session at the end. We will get to it, of course. Please keep those questions brief, concise, and on topic. The General will be glad to answer any questions on the subject matter, but will not be able to comment on off-topic questions on U.S. domestic policy. I'd like to now hand the mic over to Dr. Beatriz Gonzalez, the president of Miami Dade College Wolfson Campus, who will say a few words. I'll return shortly to moderate today's conversation. Thereafter, thank you very much. We hope you enjoy the program.
Thank you so much, Aaron, and welcome everyone to our wonderful Wolfson Campus here at the heart of it all in our dynamic downtown. As a community college, our purpose is to be of and for the community, and the primary way that we do that is through direct instruction of students, and that elevates them, it elevates their families, and then it elevates the community. But the other thing that we do as a community college when we of and for the community is to be a co-creator of the public sphere, to bring people together to learn, to be in civil dialogue so that we can be better community members, smarter voters. And so thank you for being here with us today to be co-creator of this common public space where we can engage together in dialogue. I want to thank the World Affairs Council. It's a great partnership, and it allows us to bring this sort of programming that is wonderful for our community, for our students, for our faculty. It's inspirational, and it allows us to just keep moving forward in our true mission here of education. And of course, we are very grateful to General Petraeus for being here today. We are honored and so pleased that you're here. And now to introduce you formally, I would like to bring forward a spectacular student we have here, Jennifer Suarez, who is the head of the Honor Society. She's also the lead delegate in Model UN. She will be graduating at the end of the semester. And so please welcome Jennifer Suarez for this introduction.
you so much for that wonderful introduction. So as you heard, I am the Model UN head delegate here for Miami Dade College. And part of the reason why I joined Model UN was because I believed in opening that dialogue to students and giving us that platform where we're able to share our thoughts, our opinions, and kind of practice the art of diplomacy. However, if you would have asked me before I joined Model UN, because this is my second year in Model UN, I would have told you I don't even like politics like that. But that's not the case anymore, because I'm more than happy to be partnered with the World Affairs Council and to have Miami Dade College offer these opportunities to the student body here. And of course, I'm really honored to have the opportunity to introduce General David Petraeus. So with that being said, please welcome General David Petraeus, as he is a partner at KKR and chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he established in May of 2013. He is also an academic and co-author of Conflict, the Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. And prior to joining the KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the as the U.S. General Officer, 5 of which were in combat, including the command of the surge in Iraq, command of the U.S. Central Command, and the command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following retirement from the military and after Senate confirmation by a vote of 94-0, he served as director of the CIA. General Petraeus graduated with distinction from the U.S. Military Academy and is the only person in Army history to be the top graduate of both the demanding U.S. Army Ranger School and the U.S. Army's year-long Command and General Staff College. He has also earned a PhD in International Relations and Academics from Princeton University. With that said, please help me in welcoming to the stage General David Petraeus. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Well, since I got the microphone first, and no 4-star general ever lets a microphone go without a little bit of nudging. Look, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all. Thanks for pulling this together. Thanks for what you've done to establish, to found, and then to lead the World Affairs Council of Miami. I've done dozens of these WWII councils all around the United States, including the overall gathering, and I think they serve a very, very important purpose. Madam President, thanks for allowing us to use your campus. I love your phrase, co-creator of the public sphere. I may have to steal that, although I will be sure to acknowledge it, given the challenges with plagiarism in our academic spaces these days. And then Jennifer, thanks for that very kind introduction. I like your commitment to dialogue, especially, frankly, at a time when emotions are running so high that dialogue seems difficult to have, and I certainly hope that that's what we'll have here today. So with that, Aaron, I allow you to conduct this interrogation without enhanced interrogation techniques, which I opposed from the very beginning.
I'll be gentle. Thank you, General. We appreciate having you here. So we prepared some questions on a few different themes corresponding to the wide variety of topics that your book covers. The first is going to look at the historical evolution of warfare, which your book traces. Your book does so tracing that evolution from the ashes of the more conventional, state-centric conflicts of World War II to the less clear, often asymmetric and hybrid warfare witnessed today. However, as you're quick to point out, that evolution is not necessarily absolute. In Ukraine, for example, some tactics and technology are cutting edge. Others date back to the Cold War, the Second World War, the First World War, right? So the question is, how are we to understand how warfare has been changing since the end of the 40s? And why are we seeing now in Ukraine such a, let's say, a smorgasbord of different tech and technology and tactics at play?
Well, in fact, you're right. Ukraine has been characterized by the great Washington Post columnist and author Max Boot as the war in which all quiet on the Western Front meets Blade Runner. As you noted, certain aspects of it are reminiscent of World War I, trenches, barbed wire, lots of artillery, almost no man's lands and so forth, very deep minefields. And yet right over those minefields are fairly advanced drones. They're not necessarily the absolute cutting edge, but we're seeing quite a bit of activity with a variety of different unmanned systems in Ukraine. And I think this all just reminds us that war does not evolve in sort of a linear fashion. It actually makes fits and starts. Sometimes it regresses, and sometimes it brings together all of the different capabilities. In that period that we cover from World War II to the present, and of course the book was published just a week in the United States, just a week after 10/7, the horrible Hamas barbaric massacre of so many Israeli citizens and taking hostage of a number of others. And I'm happy to talk about that, and particularly perhaps apply the intellectual construct that we lay out for strategic leadership in the book, which the president of Wolfson Campus will recognize, I think, because anybody at the top of an organization has to perform the 4 tasks that we enumerate. But again, it's that warfare, again, very much evolves in a nonlinear fashion. We've seen periods where it leaps ahead, and we've seen periods where it falls back. We talk about the near genocide in Rwanda. It is called the War of the Machetes. I mean, the killing instrument in that war was actually the machete. And yet you see in the battlefield in Ukraine, you also see it, frankly, in Gaza, very advanced capabilities, and yet some very, very simplistic ones being employed right alongside those. And I think that's really the nature of future conflict, unless you end up in a situation of truly superpower kind of engagement that could be very, very different in terms of very, very substantial numbers of cutting-edge unmanned systems, not just in the air, which we've come to get used to, although they continue to evolve, and you now even have suicide drones and so forth in addition to the traditional ones, but also unmanned systems on the surface, maritime drones under the surface, on ground, in outer space, and even in cyberspace, where we actually have the equivalent of unmanned systems attacking various networks, hundreds of thousands or more times a day if you're in the Defense Department, for example.
Thank you, General. I'd like to also touch on one of the other recurring themes in your book, which is leadership, and particularly strategic leadership. One of the points you make is how strategic leadership done right is the key to making the most out of a bad situation. First, I wonder whether you could elaborate on how you define strategic leadership, and then offer some examples that your book lays out where it did make that categorical difference.
Sure. Well, as we went through this, in the beginning, the very beginning, Andrew Roberts, Lord Roberts, again of Belgravia, that needy constituency of beautiful white townhomes in London, we set out an intellectual construct for the exercise of strategic leadership. Again, that's the leadership at the very top. Now, we tend to focus on the senior military leader, the commander of, say, for example, surge in Iraq or surge in Afghanistan. But the truth is there's also a political leadership that's on top of it that makes very, very fundamental decisions. This is Prime Minister Thatcher who says this will not stand about the Argentinian invasion of the Falklands. It's George H.W. Bush who says the same thing about Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait literally at the first meeting of the National Security Council, and that's the fundamental decision. But once those have been made, it's up to the senior military leader, the theater commander of a war, to translate that into, again, an actual strategy. So there are 4 tasks, and as I mentioned, again, I think the president here will recognize, number one is you have to really understand the context in which you're operating, and you have to get the big ideas right. In other words, you have to develop the right strategy. In the case of conflict, you have to understand the enemy forces, your forces, of course, what you're trying to achieve, the task and the purpose for achieving that task. You have to understand the physical terrain, the human terrain. You have to understand how the country that you might be invading, as we did twice in my time in final decade in uniform, how it's supposed to operate, how it really operates, the neighborhood, all of this. And then, again, as I said, get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively throughout the breadth and depth of your organization and to everyone who has a stake in the outcome of the conflict or the enterprise. You have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership, actually. This is the example that the leader provides. It's the energy, the inspiration. It's how the leader spends his or her time, the battle rhythm. We spent an enormous amount of time when I was the commander of the surge in Iraq and then in Afghanistan, laying out what I did on a daily basis, without fail, 7 days a week combat. Then what we did several times a week, twice a week, once a week, every other week, monthly, quarterly. It's the metrics that you use to determine whether you're winning or losing, making progress or falling back. It's hiring the very best people you can find, attracting them, hanging on to them for as long as you can, developing them. It's allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. It's all of that. That's the overseeing the implementation. That's driving the implementation of the campaign plan that you developed in the big ideas, communicated through a variety of different means, and now are actually translating, or you're privileged to lead are translating into reality on a battlefield. And then there's a fourth task that's often overlooked, which has to be done formally by events that are on your battle rhythm that enable you to determine how the big ideas need to be refined so that you can do the process again and again, or sometimes that force you to determine how the big ideas, because the truth is, this stuff is hard. And there are days you don't feel like making tough decisions. You just as soon push it down the road. It's 110 degrees outside, and there's a 25 to 35 knot breeze every afternoon, wind really, blowing sand in your face, and you're taking tough casualties, and the enemy gets a vote, and you're in a tug of war with the prime minister of the country you're trying to help secure, et cetera, and another congressional delegations coming in, and there's a video conference with the president tomorrow, and CNN is waiting outside for you to explain what happened that day. All of this. So that's the intellectual construct for strategic leadership that I developed personally between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, the one non-combat command that I had as a general officer of 6. And that was also the period during which we developed the counterinsurgency field manual, during which we overhauled every aspect of professional development courses of our commissioned, non-commissioned warrant officers. I had a position that had 6 different hats, 6 different titles, basically. And if you used them all, if you kept the hats spinning fast enough, you could get away with anything, especially because the Chief of Staff of the Army, when I asked him for guidance, he said, "Shake up the Army, Dave." I said, "Chief, I can do that if you have my back," and he did. We overhauled all of the road to deployment, if you will, all the tasks that a brigade-size unit would do over a period of a year to prepare for deployment to Iraq or to Afghanistan, and so forth. So again, that model was one I used explicitly when I went back to Iraq for the 4-star tour, having already been there by that point in time for nearly 2.5 years as a 2-star and then 3-star commander. I should note, it applies in any endeavor in life, whether as any one where, again, you are the strategic leader. The truth is that any leader at any level actually performs these 4 tasks. The difference is that the person at the very top especially has to get the overarching big ideas right, because everyone else is operating within the decisions that the senior leader has made. And I hope that this does indeed resonate with the president, because, again, whether you explicitly use this construct as laid out, if you are a successful strategic leader, you are performing these 4 tasks, whether you name them those tasks or not. I often use the example of Netflix. I think that Reed Hastings has been one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jeff Bezos of Amazon, Jack Ma of Alibaba, and so forth. And I talked to Reed Hastings about this model, and he has one very, very similar. And I'll illustrate his performance of this, again, to bring Netflix from a modest little company whose first big idea, the first incarnation of 4 major incarnations, and maybe some others, but that was to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So they're going to undercut Blockbuster, which some of you may actually be old enough to remember as how we used to actually rent movies on a Friday night before a weekend when they were still VHS tapes, I think. And, so he could undersell Blockbuster, and did it so successfully. So, of course, that's the big idea. He communicates it effectively through his own organization, then to all the potential customers out there. He oversees the implementation of this big idea, and then he sits down and determines, okay, what do we do next? Because it's a couple of years in, Blockbuster is going out of business, but other people are crowding into what it is that we're doing. So what's the new big idea? He said, well, the context has changed. Broadband speeds are vastly more faster now than they were before. And so now the new big idea is going to be we're going to have people download movies. And so communicates that overseas. It gets down here. How's that going? Fantastic. They're really growing. And then he has a really bold big idea, which is that Netflix, we're going to make our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, all these other iconic series that we know and love, and especially revisited during the early months of COVID, works through that. And then the final big idea is we're going to make major motion pictures. And he goes out and buys not one, but 2 major movie studios, and does so well, how is this for a metric, does so well that Netflix several years ago got more Academy Award nominations than any other major motion picture studio. Now, I did take issue. I met with him and discussed some of this stuff, and I did note that the movie in which Brad Pitt played my very close combat friend, General McChrystal, I thought was really a total bust. He just didn't get General McChrystal, who actually has a sense of humor. He doesn't march around like a little wooden soldier. He doesn't salute stiffly all the time. And I said, besides, I just couldn't get past the fact that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. But you get the idea. Actually, the guy who played me was that Australian actor who played Gladiator, Russell Crowe. And I've never literally been able to stay awake long enough in the movie. I only watch movies on airplanes anyway. But I've never stayed awake long enough to actually get to the point where Russell Crowe does his little bit piece on me when I emerge on the scene in Afghanistan, or as his boss, whatever it was. Anyway, so you get the idea here. Strategic leadership is the determining factor of who wins and who loses in combat. For example, in Vietnam, the strategic leader who was the best by far was neither the French commander in their days in Indochine, Indochina, when they had a terribly bad big idea, Dien Bien Phu. Finally we're going to attract the enemy who's actually going to come to combat. We can't get these guerrillas to actually fight us in the jungle. We're going to create a huge base. They'll never get artillery up on those hillsides over there. They sure did, and they lost. Went into captivity and eventually separated North and South Vietnam at a Geneva agreement. We come in, and we didn't even get the right big ideas for the first 13 years that we were there. We wanted to fight a small war as a big war, as a war of attrition, with a body count metric, where it was the wrong metric, and also then became questionable in terms of integrity. It undermined everything. Instead of focusing on security of the people, which would have had very different metrics, such as the ones that we had during the surge in Iraq. And the surge in Iraq, by the way, the surge that mattered most wasn't the additional forces. And I know we have some folks in here who are part of that, and I thank you yet again for that. The surge that mattered most was the surge of ideas. As important as the additional forces were in implementing the new strategy, but we reversed 180 degrees what we'd been doing prior. Change leadership doesn't get any bigger than that. So that gives you some sense of this. And I'd add finally, it took us 9 years just to get the inputs right in Afghanistan after a brilliant initial campaign when the Taliban refused to turn over al-Qaeda and eliminate the sanctuary in which the 9/11 attacks were planned and the initial training was conducted. We went in, we toppled the Taliban, we eliminated that sanctuary, albeit with Osama bin Laden getting away that time. We got him 10 years later when I happened to be the commander in Afghanistan, in fact, although it was our special mission unit that got him. But we then took our eye off it, focused on Iraq, and we didn't really return significant focus for a number of years. And so it ended up taking us 9 years until we got the right strategy, the right organizational architecture to implement that strategy, almost the right level of forces, almost the right level of diplomats, spies, development workers, rule of law experts, financial, you name it, anything to help build institutional capacity, and the right leaders and the right preparation of our forces. And we only kept it right for about 6 months because the president, in announcing the buildup of these forces, which took us about the better part of a year, also announced that we would start drawing down on a particular date, which tells the enemy with whom you're in a contest of wills, don't worry, we're going to start drawing down regardless of the conditions. And again, it was something that I thought was ill-advised.
Thank you for the comprehensive response, General. Really appreciate that.
That's what you get.
Yeah, no problem.
Sorry.
I think it
By
provided
the way, I just might add, there are very few problems in the world that have single factor solutions. It's always a comprehensive approach. And beyond that, of course, you can never go wrong. Having taught economics in my various academic endeavors, you can never go wrong by starting by answering, it depends. Because it does.
Absolutely. Well, I want to take some of that thinking and apply it toward Ukraine. General, you've traveled to Ukraine, wartime Ukraine as well, you've met with President Zelensky. You have described his leadership as Churchillian, which, having co-authored this book with Lord Roberts, who literally wrote the book on Churchill.
The best single volume biography of Churchill.
That carries some meaning.
Also a New York Times bestseller.
That carries some meaning, right? So I was wondering.
Actually, he's been termed Churchill with an iPhone.
It's a good term. I was wondering if you could offer a bit more of a detailed assessment applying this sort of paradigm to Zelensky's leadership style.
Absolutely.
And that big picture you're talking about.
And Putin as well.
Exactly. Thank you.
So, again, let's apply these 4 tasks, President Zelensky's performance of them. First of all, what's his first big idea? I don't want to ride. A number of countries said, hey, you need to get out of Kyiv. We'll take you to Lviv in the west part or all the way to Europe, set up a wartime government in exile in London. He said, I don't want to ride. I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to fight to the death for Kyiv, our capital. All males are going to stay in Ukraine, and we're going to mobilize the entire country. That's a pretty good set of big ideas right at the outset, and generally has adhered to those. His communication skills have been extraordinary. That's where they talk about him being Churchill with an iPhone. But not surprisingly, he is an actor after all. That was his profession, and he was actually a comedian who played the president so effectively on TV that they actually elected him president in real life. And so his ability to communicate to his own people, to his men and women in uniform, his government, to each of our governments, the way he addressed the House of Commons in the UK, the Bundestag in Berlin, our Congress, both houses. In fact, the first wartime leader to address both houses of our Congress since Churchill did so back during World War II. And in each case, he had a very specific set of messages that linked his struggle, their war of independence, to, say, our war of independence, our values, our principles, and so forth, and did so very effectively. He's also very effectively communicated his own big ideas for the war. And then overseeing the implementation. Think of his example. He changes from a suit in the first day into a uniform, and he's never taken it off. Different variations from time to time. His energy is enormous. His example, again, he goes to the front lines. He's, unlike Putin, he's actually on the battlefield in Bakhmut and Zaporizhzhia and all these other places, and pinning medals on troops and doing what wartime commanders should do. As Putin's parked at the end of a long marble table, with the minions down there somewhere. They almost have to use a microphone to speak to him. And again, in general, his exercise performance of the other tasks associated with the task of overseeing the implementation have been very impressive. And then they have indeed, from time to time, refined the big ideas and continued to do it again and again. It hasn't been flawless. There are some domestic political issues that are below the surface. If you spend enough time there, you start to get a... But really, all in all, incredibly impressive strategic leadership. even though the war is not over. And of course, he's locked in combat. Ukraine is locked in combat with a country that is more than 3 times their population and almost 10 times, if you will, the size of the economy. So some real advantages for Russia. But then you contrast that with Putin, whose initial big ideas were seriously flawed. The idea that they could invade and the U.S. and West would not respond as we have. We've not been flawless in that, but I think generally very impressive. And here I should note I don't even register to vote, much less actually engage in any kind of partisan politics, and I do advise members of either party who are serious. So Putin completely overestimated his own forces' capabilities, underestimated the Ukrainian force capabilities. The campaign plan overall was seriously flawed. Lots and lots of mistakes along the way. His communication skills to the outside world have fallen on deaf ears because it's very hard to defend a brutal, unprovoked invasion of a neighbor whose existence you refuse to acknowledge based on his grievance-filled, revanchist and revisionist view of history. That said, again, because of the advantages, and to be fair, the Russians have learned, they have adapted. They've gone out and bought Iranian drones and now missiles and North Korean artillery and missiles to augment theirs. They are cranking up. They are finally putting their country in a war footing. They have never truly, totally mobilized. They're shielding the elite, the sons and daughters of the elites in Moscow and St. Petersburg from this. But they're able to recruit enough from the rural areas with very substantial enlistment bonuses, and then also just basically from jails and prisons and everything else, that they have, first of all, stabilized the lines, and they prevented the Ukrainians from achieving what we all hoped they would this past summer, and now actually going on the offensive again. So they have this strategic initiative right now, incredibly costly, and in many cases, almost human wave attacks. But he is impervious to, it seems, to casualties, which is really striking, having spent so many nights of my time as a general officer writing letters of condolence to America's mothers and fathers in other countries as well. So again, a real compare and contrast, but this war is not over. I strongly believe that this is as much right versus wrong as you get in the world, and that it's in our national security interest, in that of our NATO allies, and also basically global prosperity, that we ensure that a country can't do to its neighbor what Russia has done to Ukraine, get away with it. And we clearly need to continue to provide additional support to the maximum extent possible, even as we do the same, certainly for Israel, for Taiwan, for this support of our southern border enforcement and policy changes there as well. All of this we can and should and must do, in my view.
Thank you, General. Turning the conversation now toward humanitarian consequences. Since the middle of the 20th century, we've seen tremendous expansion in global communications, whether initially radio and TV, and then more recently internet and now smartphones. With these advances, civilians are increasingly made aware of the impact of war also on the innocent. How do you see military and political leaders' consideration of humanitarian consequences of conflicts having transformed over time, especially considering the rise in urban warfare, civilian displacement, insurgency, counterinsurgency, topics that you are hyper-specialized in? And if this connects to some of your thoughts on the war between Israel and Gaza, please feel free to touch on that.
So first of all, one of the big developments in guiding warfare, if you will, since World War II. World War II was so horrific, and the loss of innocent life was so really, truly unbelievable, tens of millions killed, that we had the Geneva Convention and the laws of land warfare. And I know a number of individuals in here have served, and we generally have worked very, very hard to observe the Geneva Convention, in particular, to understand the concepts of military necessity in tension with proportionality. What is the importance of this particular action what are the potential losses in terms of innocent civilians and infrastructure. And obviously, you have to work very hard to keep the latter to an absolute minimum if you can't prevent it altogether. And you cannot, particularly in urban areas. Very, very difficult, particularly if you're fighting an enemy who uses civilians as human shields, as holding hostages, employs suicide bombers, suicide car bombs, and so forth. But again, you have to, my view was when dealing with the press, which is also a related issue here, was to be first with the truth. We want to beat the bad guys to the headline. They have CNN's field office in Baghdad dialed in just as we do. We want to get the headline, but we want to do it with the truth. And if we screw something up, we will acknowledge it. If we violate it, we had some very, very difficult moments. Abu Ghraib is, the terrible treatment of detainees in the Abu Ghraib prison early on in Iraq was beyond a black eye. This has caused us enormous harm around the world. It is indelible. There's no half-life to this. It's always going to be haunting us as we go forward. Those images are iconic in a very bad way, which highlights, again, why you need to adhere to this. Yes, there are certain countries that don't. Andrew Roberts and I wrote a piece explaining that we believe that Russia's culture in their military is the antithesis of observing the Geneva Convention. And we went to locations outside Kyiv, for example, where there were real, again, atrocities carried out. These are violations, again, these are criminal actions as judged by any norms, but especially by the post-World War II laws of land warfare. So you need to adhere to those. We had a sign on the wall of every one of the command posts of organizations I was privileged to lead that was always staring me in the face. And it asked, will this operation take more bad guys off the street than it creates by its conduct? If the answer to that is no, in other words, that by doing this operation, you're going to create more bad guys than you take off the street, you're supposed to go back and figure out how you can get to yes. How do you change the conduct of the design of that operation so that you can, in fact, avoid that outcome? If you can't do that, you really should go rethink it. We occasionally used to say, go sit under a tree until the thought passes. Now, again, there are moments of necessity. There are targets that are so critically, vitally important that you have to take additional risk. But again, if you think about, if you get the construct for an operation right, for a campaign right, generally, you need to be very, very concerned about hearts and minds, which is a phrase that brings to mind counterinsurgency campaigns. In fact, it was first used by Sir Gerald Templer in the Malayan emergency, as it was called, the UK, when the Malaysians were fighting against communist guerrillas who were trying to take over the country. And it's an example of a very, very impressive campaign. It's one of the ones we focused on when we were doing the counterinsurgency field manual. But again, you can't kill innocent people and expect that they're going to embrace you, the next day. So is this true of policies too, by the way? We were inadequately prepared for the post-conflict phase of the fight to Baghdad. Again, a very impressive campaign to get to Baghdad, topple the government and the Saddam Hussein regime, and then we fumbled the ball thereafter. We weren't sufficiently prepared for the post-conflict phase, and then we employed two really bad ideas, big ideas, which was to fire the Iraqi military without telling them how we were going to enable them to provide for their families. So this is hundreds of thousands of individuals whose incentive is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. And we could have used them, actually. I was already in northern Iraq, having done the fight to Baghdad. I was a two-star commander of the 101st Airborne Division, and we'd already jumped north to Mosul. We were already training Iraqi security forces of all different ethnicities and sects. And we had a government put together already. We had the university reopened. This is a university of 20,000 people, or 30,000 people with 20 colleges. So not quite as big as the overall Miami Dade, but a very substantial enterprise. And the firing of the military, and then the firing of the Ba'ath Party, this is Saddam's party, sure, you need to fire the top 2 or 3 levels, but when you went to level 4, these are the bureaucrats, most of them Western educated, that we actually needed to run a country that we didn't sufficiently understand still. Tens of thousands of them who are then thrown on the ash heap of history because there's no other employment in a country that is so completely dominated by the government, an oil-rich country like Iraq. So again, you have to constantly think through that question, whether it's an operation or a policy. I think that our country's leadership, President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and others have been right to, on the one hand, completely embrace and support Israel, our partner, closest partner in the Middle East. Enormous relationships there, as you might imagine, as a former military and also director of the CIA, but also to caution them, again, about certain aspects, although I don't agree with all of those cautions, because I tend to think that it is almost inevitable that Israel is going to have to control the Gaza territory, the Gaza Strip, because there is no other alternative that I see. I'd love to see a competent, capable, trustworthy Palestinian entity, deploy from the West Bank to Gaza to take over. There's not one, frankly, in the West Bank, much less on deployment orders. So to very quickly look at that particular effort, I already noted obviously the extraordinary loss on 10/7. If you put that into U.S. terms, remembering that we lost not quite 3,000 in the 9/11 attacks, if you put it in our per capita, this would equate to some 42,000, the 1,200 that were killed, and then the 240 hostages would be somewhere 6,000 or 7,000. That's just almost unthinkable, again, and it is unthinkable. And it has, I think, rightly enraged and created a desire, an understandable desire for vengeance, but you have to temper that. I agree with the 3 big ideas that they have right now, which is, number 1, you have to destroy Hamas. This is an extremist group, an extremist army, really equivalent to that of the Islamic State. You cannot reconcile with them the way we reconciled with the rank and file of certain insurgent groups during the surge in Iraq. They have to be captured or killed. That's a tough reality, but I believe that that is correct. By the way, destroy in military terms means to render the enemy incapable of accomplishing his mission without reconstitution. Keep in mind reconstitution. You have to prevent that as part of your operation. But that doesn't mean you have to get every single leader and by any means capture or kill all of them, but to render them incapable of doing what they want to do. And they can't reconstitute. But so this is destroy, dismantle the political wing. Obviously, they can't allow Hamas to continue to run Gaza. That's how they were able to do all that they have. And then obviously to get their hostages back. I tend to think there are several additional big ideas that would be well advised to announce publicly. One would be, what is the lot in life? What is life going to be like for the Palestinians in Gaza and while they're at it in the West Bank? And I think the big idea is we're going to make your life better. When we set out to clear large cities during the surge in Iraq and to destroy al-Qaeda in those cities, Ramadi, Fallujah, Baquba, Mosul, parts of Baghdad, etc., we told the people, we're going to make your life better. We're going to separate al-Qaeda and this most challenging Sunni insurgents from your areas, and we're then going to immediately provide humanitarian assistance, restore basic services, begin reconstruction, reopening schools, clinics, markets, repairing roads, et cetera, et cetera. And I think something like that would be very well advised. You need to focus, again, on the people, not just on destroying Hamas, because you're going to end up owning it. And that's, I think, acknowledging that that is going to be very likely. Everyone right now says, yes, clearly there should be a Palestinian, if you will, governance established there. That's not coming soon to a theater near us, I don't think. But certainly that's the goal in the end, and that should be laid out. But in the meantime, I think it's going to require Israeli presence on quite substantial basis to ensure that not only is Hamas destroyed, but then it's prevented from reconstitution, because that's part of that mission. And then finally, going about this in a way that, again, keeps that question in mind and employs what you call clear, hold, and build. It's not just destroy the enemy and move on. You actually have to hold on to the areas that you have cleared, or else the enemy will re-infiltrate. And then get the civilians back into their homes as quickly as you possibly can, instead of just pushing them all over Gaza, because the enemy is going with them, and the enemy is using civilians as human shields. They have hostages. Again, don't wear uniforms, urban areas. It's the most fiendishly difficult context, Andrew Roberts and I believe, in any urban setting since the end of World War II.
Thank you, General. We're going to ask people to start lining up with questions, and while you do that, I'm going to ask one last question, more future-oriented here. We have a mic set up. I think we'll bring the mic up to the middle, and then once the mic is set up, form a line here in the middle, and we'll work down the aisle. General, we've spoken mostly about recent history and contemporary conflicts, but I'd like to direct our thinking now toward the future of conflict,
Sure.
the future of warfare. Miami is in the midst of the development of let's say, a tech community, a tech sector here. So a lot of people in our community are looking toward the future and thinking about future technologies and how they might impact our lives. I'm curious what your thoughts are on any novel considerations and ethical dilemmas that military and political leaders should anticipate for the future of warfare. For instance, looking at developments in artificial intelligence, cyber warfare,
Sure.
autonomous
Yep.
weaponry, and so on.
Yep.
Thank you.
So I think the big idea about the future of warfare, especially if it's between, again, the real top powers in the world, is that to prepare for it, we need to transform our forces even more rapidly than we are in the U.S. from what very simplistically might be termed a small number of large platforms, heavily manned, incredibly expensive, and also exquisitely capable, to a massive number of unmanned systems, again, just not in the air, but on ground, sea, subsea, outer space, cyberspace, and systems that increasingly will not just be remotely piloted, but will actually be algorithmically driven. In other words, the software program will guide them, and the conditions established by humans will be the instructions for them, but the human, again, is in the loop for the design of the software, not for the operation of the machine. That creates a lot of ethical concerns, understandably, but I think that is the future of warfare, because if you keep a human in the loop right up to the very end, your machine is going to end because the other guy's machine is not going to have that in it, and they'll be faster than you are. And so, again, whatever the task may be, you're going. To be fair, we do that already. Some of our counter-ballistic missile systems, the Petraeus system and so forth, you basically throw a switch that says, okay, machine, it's up to you, because it goes too fast. You know, if you're trying to hit a bullet with a bullet, you can't wait for the man to say this. You have to allow the machine to do that. So we're going to have questions. If I could just ask one thing of those who do ask questions, and that literally is one question per questioner. So that means only one question mark per question. Please.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here, especially such a trying times internationally. And thank you for your service as well. I wish you would still be there leading the teams at this time. At any rate, my name is Mildred Zipkowski. I was recently in Ukraine as a volunteer a few months ago. And I am also, just to give you context, I am also sort of, I guess you can call it a victim of the Russian policy. I am of Nicaraguan origin, and so I was part of that turmoil that happened in 1979. And I am seeing the same policies that the U.S. had with the contrast in the 80s, which was give them enough to push and make an impact on the opposing side, on the Russian side, but don't ever give them enough to win. And I want to know, and it's really heartbreaking to me to see that policy happen again. And I want to, if you could, in any way, shape, or form, help me understand how do other allies can possibly trust the United States with that kind of policy? We'll give you enough to hold on, but we won't give you enough to win. Who could possibly want to be our ally? Thank you.
First of all, thanks for what you've done to help Ukraine. Second, with great respect, I don't think I would equate our support to the Contras to what we have done to support Ukraine. The difference is just beyond compare. I mean, I actually was down in Southern Command as a special assistant for the Commander-in-Chief of Southern Command during that period for a summer period, and went to the airfield in Honduras from which that operation was being conducted, also was in El Salvador and other places. That was a pretty modest amount, and of course it was covert. That was not overt. That was a covert action carried out under Title 50, not carried out under Title 10. There's a vast difference. This is allegedly intelligence. The other one is obviously open military, which is what we're doing for Ukraine. We've provided $44 billion. I do not defend the administration's policy. I do think that they have done very well. I disagree very strongly with the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way it was conducted, and I tend to think that withdrawal actually helped to convince Putin that he could get away with what it was that he did against Ukraine. I think our response to Ukraine and the leadership of NATO and the Western world, we've kept the alliance together, kept Putin from driving a wedge between Europe and North America, et cetera, has been impressive. The overall amount is very substantial, $44 billion, albeit over a 2-year period, and with the defense budget, it's been about $1.7 trillion. But during that period, there have been decisions that have been far too slow, and then some that have not been taken. So I very much agree with you. We should have long since provided longer range Army tactical missile system, more of the dual purpose improved conventional munition cluster bombs, a number of other sophisticated systems that we have not provided. I don't think we are allowing F-16s to be transferred, but I don't believe that we have done. But in part, now they also don't have the appropriation for any more than $44 billion right now. And as you heard me say earlier, I think it's very, very important that we, as expeditiously as possible, in Congress approve the supplemental bill that includes $65 billion in additional assistance for Ukraine in security assistance, humanitarian, financial, economic, et cetera, and also to replenish our own supplies. By the way, almost all of this is actually being spent in our companies to build stuff that is needed. So no, I agree with you. I think we should be doing more in Ukraine. I think the rest of the world should be doing more in Ukraine. I think there was some legitimate concern about various forms of escalation in the early days, or even more, whether the Ukrainians really were going to fight, or all these systems, these advanced systems, were going to end up in the hands of the Russians the way those provided to the Afghans did. But I certainly wouldn't defend what the administration has done in terms of very slow decision making on some issues they eventually did approve, but too late to help with the past summer's offensive, and then in some other cases, decisions that still should be taken to enable them to liberate all of their territory from Russia. Next question, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, General Petraeus, and thank you for a fascinating and really thought-provoking discussion. Former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who recently passed, he wrote that our notion, talking about the United States, our notion of aggression as an unambiguous act and our concept of war as inevitably an all-out struggle have made it difficult to come to grips with our perils. To what extent do you agree or disagree with that statement as it may relate to the current threat from Communist China?
Well, first of all, I'm a friend of Henry Kissinger. I'm a beneficiary of his support and mentorship over the years. I was actually at his 100th birthday party last year, wrote, there's a book coming out about him. A number of us wrote essays on that and so forth. So I'm very much an admirer of him and of his thinking and of his writing, noting that often his writing is a tiny bit elliptical, and it can be interpreted in various ways, which shows real skill, by the way. You sort of navigate this stuff. No, look, I generally agree with his predisposition as well, that, if you have to choose between freedom and order, you go for order, because without order there is no freedom. These kinds of concepts, I think, are general. It's how do you apply this in a specific case that becomes more difficult. And in that case, again, I think some of these, how do you, okay, it's a great statement, it is scholarly, it's erudite, it's thoughtful, but what does that mean when it comes to this? And I think that's a little bit more challenging. We generally, though, were generally aligned on issues. I didn't agree with him on the idea that NATO should not expand. I thought, in fact, in his final year, he actually said that now that NATO security begins at the Ukraine-Russia border. But again, I just find it difficult to interpret that kind of statement and say that it is anything but thoughtful, erudite, thought-provoking, and scholarly. But how do I apply that specifically? How does that help to shape the big ideas that are really what matter in this kind of thing? And what I've tried to do as an exercise was to do that specifically for the case of Israel in his war with Hamas. Next question, please, but thank you for that.
Hey, General Petraeus, thanks so much for coming. My question is regarding Israel and Palestine. I think generally everybody agrees that Hamas is the enemy, and there has to be somehow, some way to eliminate Hamas. But where there seems to be disagreements, whether it's older generation or the younger generation, is how Israel goes about eliminating Hamas. Most specifically, how has resulted with over 10,000, 20,000 perhaps, civilian deaths. And I think one argument is that, well, the people that are the sons of the people that have died potentially may be the future enemies that
Sure.
want to eliminate
Yep.
Israel. So my question to you is, if you were advising the Israeli government, what would you advise them on how they can go about eliminating Hamas while at the same time hopefully reducing the amount of civilian deaths? Thank you.
I think I've really sort of addressed that, but perhaps not quite as clearly, I guess. I mean, again, you constantly ask yourself that question. If your goal is to provide a better future for the people, which is what we were out to do, say, in Iraq, and destroy al-Qaeda, you take great pains not to kill or injure the people you are setting about liberating. Now, it's a little bit different approach in this case because the focus clearly is on the destruction of Hamas. But again, you have to understand that if you create the next generation of extremists, of terrorists, of Hamas recruits, by the way you carry out operations to destroy Hamas, you're not going to achieve your long-run goals. So I think they are increasingly cognizant of that. I think, again, the president has not shrunk from saying that publicly. The vice president has done the same, I think, in Florida, as a matter of fact, as I recall a speech here. Secretary of State has done it repeatedly. Numerous members of Congress have said, yes, we need to see Hamas destroyed, but the way in which you do that matters. And that's really, I think, the answer to your question. I would go farther and say, I talked about what is the future of the Palestinian people in Hamas, in Gaza, and also in the West Bank. I think there is no alternative to the two states for two people. There is none. For all of those that say, well, that's not possible, okay, great. Tell me what your idea is, and then help figure out how to make it possible. And at the very least, as a big idea, do not create more obstacles to a two-state solution in the West Bank or in Hamas, and try to build up the institutions of the Palestinian entity, if you will, build up the economy, build up education, build up the infrastructure, so that at least because again, there's a very legitimate argument that Abu Mazen, the leader of a Palestinian Authority, who's on his 19th year of a 4-year presidency and has never held elections since that first one that put him in power, He's not able to make compromises, and he's also allowed and encouraged, in some cases, a variety of policies that are very antithetical to two states or two people, including pay for slay, as it's called, essentially incentivizing violence against Israelis, or at least paying the families of those who carry that out while they're in jail, in this kind of policy, which is very wrong-headed and counterproductive. That should not, however, prevent us from trying to help create institutions and to caution our Israeli partners against creating additional obstacles to a two-state solution. Next, please.
Yes, my name is,
Sorry, I think we're running a little short on time, so I think what we'll do is we'll take the questions, but maybe we'll condense a couple of them. So maybe we can
No,
do
we're
a
just going to
couple.
take one at a time, sorry.
One at a time?
Old guys can only keep one in their mind at one time.
Okay.
Please, and then if we just run out of time, then
we're
that's...
only focused on the guy in front of us.
Exactly, yes, sir.
Right?
Thank
Straight
you.
ahead.
Roger.
Name is Andy Elfmont, and I've spent a lot of time thinking that you have Putin, and in the absence of him changing his mind or a leadership change that's different than Putin, where they want to work and drop the Ukraine thing, we're in this war of attrition, and they got tons of people pulling, and the world seems to be changing in respect to the support of Ukraine. I know in the US you have the Republican side and this, that, and Europe. So Ukraine, how do they get out? I mean,
No,
if they
we
make-
have to continue to support them, is the
Right,
bottom line.
but
And
if-
by the way, there is very broad bipartisan support, massive bipartisan support in the Senate, strong bipartisan support in the House, but albeit with the majority party there having real challenges with a particular wing of their party.
But my question is, he'll keep at it potentially.
Yep.
If Ukraine makes a deal, they make a boundary, he'll just keep building, come at it again.
He has maximalist objectives. He's not going to be satisfied with, and by
How
the
do
way, he's
you-
not open to negotiations right now
Then how do
anyway,
you
other
get
than
an
as a
end
stalling
game? How do
tactic.
you end this war? Is it going to be some
You
kind
enable
of an-
Ukraine to liberate their territory, you bring them into NATO, and you bring them
Bring
into
them
the
in.
EU, and you have a Marshall Plan for them, and you give them the $300 billion in foreign reserves that Russia has stashed
So you got
in
to
the
bring him
Western
into
world.
NATO to get the guarantee against Russia.
It's one way of doing it, sure, certainly, yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
There is no way other than a guarantee,
Not that I've been able to come up with, and
That's
if I
the
had,
problem.
I'd share it.
because they can't stop.
Thank you.
Otherwise
No,
they'll get
exactly
taken off.
right. You're exactly right. You bet. Thank you.
General Petraeus, thank you for doing this event.
Sure.
I'm a board officer as well at the World Affairs Council, so it's extremely exciting for us. So thank you. Well, my question was about not potentiality as a word, but possibility maybe of near-peer conflict for the United States, and recognizing the fact that the U.S. has spent most of its focus on asymmetric warfare in recent history, and I know there's been shifts. Perhaps even in procurement, towards preparing for potentiality of near-peer conflict. But would you mind sharing a little bit about what you've seen?
Sure,
about that?
yeah. No, I mean, we've had, the best term for what we have done is not the pivot to Asia, because that worries people from whom we're pivoting away, is to rebalance our focus to the Indo-Pacific. We have done that. The transformation of our forces, I think, should be accelerated in the way that I described earlier. But there are enormous efforts ongoing to ensure that deterrence in the Indo-Pacific is rock solid, keeping in mind that the big idea about deterrence is that it rests on two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. We have to continue to transform our capabilities. We have a whole host of initiatives, Pacific Deterrence Initiative in particular. It's 10 to 15 billion a year, has been for several years, which is to harden our bases, to disperse our forces, to improve their defenses, a variety of other, put headquarters underground, et cetera, in that region, shore up our alliances, partnerships, agreements, defense agreements, and so on. And then the effort, again, to transform from these very large platforms that are incredibly capable, and I loved having two aircraft carrier task forces in the Central Command region when I was privileged to command it, but they're also very vulnerable. And, you know, we used to have an adage in the Cold War days that said what can be seen can be hit, what can be hit can be killed. The truth is we couldn't see all that much anyway, and we couldn't hit it if it was moving. So we recited it a lot, but we really couldn't operationalize it. In the case of the Indo-Pacific, you can see just about everything that's on the surface and above. And you can hit it increasingly with very accurate hypersonic that maneuver at the last minute and will be very difficult to defend against. And therefore, you've got to go through that transformation that I've described. But that's the focus of that. It really, that particular contingency is the focus of our military, albeit supporting Ukraine. I mean, people occasionally say, oh my God, we're fighting 2 wars and how can we continue? We're not fighting 2 wars. The Ukrainians are fighting a war, our Israeli partners are fighting a war. We're supporting them. They're not asking for our men and women to join in. So we can do all of this. We have the unique ability and responsibility, I believe, to be the guy in the circus who's keeping all these different plates spinning. The plates represent the challenges, the threats, et cetera. The China plate is bigger and more important than all the other plates in the room, and we can't lose sight of that, even as we are helping Ukraine deal with the Russia plate and dealing with the North Korea plate and various Iran plates and Islamist extremist group plates and cyber threat plates and even plates that represent manifestations of global warming, which are threatening as well. So all of this, but we can, and I believe should, and not because of, this is a charitable inclination, it's because it's in our national security interest and in the interest of our prosperity, which is also hinged with the interest of others. And we have allies and partners uniquely that our adversaries generally don't have to help keep these plates spinning if we recognize their importance and their value. Thanks.
Thank you, General.
General, thank you again. Patrick Misiewicz, World Affairs Council Director, Chairman for Century Syrian Program. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for working with us and with Miami Dade College on bringing this knowledge and conversations to our community. And while I have 7 questions, I will focus on the most long one. Ukraine, to win the war, needs to increase attrition ratio for Russia, making it unsustainable to keep sending bodies to absorb bullets. Today, estimates shows 1-to-3 ratio in human losses for Russia. And in Avdiivka, we see 1-to-5 ratio in human casualties and 1-to-10 in armored vehicles. The unsustainable ratio is being set starting above 1-to-6, and while F-16s will increase air power, Bradleys will save more lives and destroy more BMPs, but it's the ATACMS that will be the biggest game changer for Ukraine. And we did send already 20, destroying 8 alligators on the first strike. And here's the question. What are the obstacles on the policy decision-making level to push this forward, and how public opinion can weigh in for a positive decision for equipment that is about to expire and cost the taxpayers for decommissioning, while $65 billion appropriations to work on?
Well, the answer to the latter question is, call your congressman or your senator, make your views known, and get as many of like-minded citizens to do the same. That's how the system works. In addition to, obviously, the convictions that many of them have, which are quite strong. To support Ukraine in, again, fighting this war of independence, fighting for its very survival. The individual decision is a little more difficult. Certainly there's an opportunity to do the same thing there. The challenges in policy terms generally have to do with if there is actually some kind of opportunity cost. In other words, if a system that we provide would actually be useful to us in another scenario that is of enormous consequence, that's an understandable tension. There's a trade-off there. We've seen, for example, the expenditure of 155 millimeter howitzer rounds. Well, we also want to provide those to Israel. We could use those in a Korea context, a little less likely in some of the others. So that's a general kind of construct. And then the concern has been that I think no longer is as valid as it was at the outset, which is something about escalation of this conflict that could engage the rest of NATO or bring the use of tactical nuclear weapons or something like that. I think that is increasingly unlikely, especially because of President Xi of China and Prime Minister Modi of India telling Putin directly and publicly that he should not even contemplate that idea. And I think we'll take one last question.
Thank you.
Thank you. And sorry to the rest of you, my apologies.
No worries, no worries. Raul Mas, thank you, General, for being with us. Real pleasure to have you here in Miami, and thank you, Miami-Dade, for hosting this event. Thank you, Aaron. My questions are following. It seems to me that, one of the things you've talked about here is wars are difficult, right? I mean, they're complicated.
Very
strategy
complicated,
sometimes,
complex.
The initial strategy
Yep.
doesn't work, the contact with the enemy doesn't survive past, first contact, right? Things change dramatically. But one of the things that I've come to believe is that one of the problems that we have, particularly in our country, and we saw this after 9/11, a very small percentage of Americans went to war. The rest of America, after a lot of hoo-ha, basically went back to the mall. They went back to their daily lives. They did not have skin in the game. And unfortunately, these wars, as you've mentioned, look at the Malaysian emergency, right? I mean, that lasted a dozen years. Look at Afghanistan. They take decades sometimes. The question is, how do we get the American public to have skin in the game and to understand that these conflicts are bloody, they're nasty, they're not easily resolved, they're going to take years. This is not a football game where we start and we finish, and if it's a tie, we have a tiebreaker. How do we change that mentality? Because I don't think we're going to be able to be successful at war fighting if we're given a timetable of you better do this in a year or 2 years or we're out of there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I entirely agree with the premise, actually, with great respect. In fact, it is probably because a very small number of Americans actually were serving that we were able to carry out these wars for as many years as we did. I was not troubled, by the way, by the fact that, we went to war and the rest of America went shopping. That's why we went to war, to allow America to continue their daily lives, to do a Super Bowl again. I agreed with them conducting the Super Bowl that first year. It's almost a sign of resilience, a sign of, spitting in the face of adversity and the extremists who brought it to our shores. There's a different argument, if you want to make it, about the value of national service that you can get into. That's a tough one because on the one hand, I very much believe in the virtues of national service. I just don't want to go to war with a force that doesn't want to be there and is only there for a year or 18 months because you just can't get them to the level. We never could have carried out a sophisticated campaign like we did during the surge in Iraq with a drafty army. And in fact, we saw that in Vietnam. We also saw, by the way, they had skin in the game all right, and that's why they were demonstrating against the war at a certain point. Although we should acknowledge that war, we were at that war for 20 years as well, even though, again, there were very, very substantial demonstrations. The truth is, I think we could have continued in Afghanistan. I don't think most Americans were even aware of the fact that we still had 3,500 troops on the ground because we hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. And if the big idea is that you can carry out a war that is sustainable or a strategy that is sustainable, sustainability is measured in the expenditure of blood. Again, hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months, and not because of the flawed agreement by the previous administration with the Taliban, but because we were no longer on the front lines. We were advising, assisting, and enabling, not fighting, with the exception of some special mission unit raids. And then cost and treasure. And, we'd gotten it down to about $25 billion out of a defense budget of $800+ billion. That's affordable for the United States. And I argued that the alternative, however maddening, frustrating, et cetera, the situation was and the security had eroded, and yes, our partners were far from perfect, they were very imperfect, and on and on. I got all that. But this is better than what I fear will happen if we pull out. And I said that publicly, and I stand by that because I think what has transpired has not only been heartbreaking and tragic, it's been disastrous for the people that we were actually trying to help achieve a better life. So I don't know that I actually buy the notion that because others don't have, quote, skin in the game, they're not willing to support. I think they are actually willing to support. And in fact, to be fair, in many respects, they knew that they didn't have skin in the game, resulted in them actually really supporting our men and women in uniform and their family members, even, or at least appreciating them, even if they didn't agree with the policies that we were implementing at times. So there's a couple of different questions in that particular question. And the one I find more difficult, in all honesty, is because I firmly believe in a professional force. That's what you need. Now, we have challenges recruiting. That's a different issue. It's related to the fact that we have had historically low unemployment for a very long period of time, that the propensity to serve among those who can qualify, which is a smaller number because of the problems of obesity, mental illness, drug use, and incarceration, all of which are generally disqualifying to some degree. And then you add to that the propensity to serve going down. In part, believe it or not, I think it's linked to the fact that we're no longer at war. Look, I was the officiating the re-enlistment officer at the largest re-enlistment ceremony in military history, 1,215 men and women in uniform, in Baghdad during the second year of the surge. And I'm looking out at this sea of soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines with their right hand in the air reciting the oath after me, asking, what is this all about? I mean, they're already through their enlistment, so they'd been to war a year on, a year off, a year on, a year off. By doing this, because we're still at very high commitment in Iraq, and we're going to start doing more in Afghanistan, they're going back to war. And I realize, and there's no stock options here. There's no, what's the, the comps of this aren't, there's nothing, I mean, there's some re-enlistment bonuses, but that's not quite enough. I realize they feel very privileged to serve a mission larger than self, to do, particularly at a time of war for our country. Now, yes, you got to survive to enjoy that privilege, but by and large, we'd gotten to that point. And they felt privileged to serve together with others who felt the same way. And I know there's a lot of people in here who have actually worn the uniform who came up earlier and understand what I'm talking about. And then the third element is the one that's linked to your question, which is that they actually really appreciated that those back home who went shopping when we went to war appreciated what it is that they are doing and supported them and their families, again, even if they disagreed with the policies. It takes a time of war actually to get that kind of emotion. We're not as at war now. There's still certainly people deployed in various places, some of whom are actually in combat zones, but nowhere near, this was 165,000 men and women in just the U.S. uniforms alone, just in Iraq. I had 250,000 when I commanded Central Command. And so that's yet another factor in this. But we'll figure out how to solve the recruiting dilemma. They'll increase enlistment bonuses. We're providing already, I love a particularly novel Army approach, which says, you know what, we realize you're not in shape to join our force right now. We can help you with that. And if you want to get in shape, sign right here and we'll put you into a pre-enlistment program, and we're going to do something for you that you'd pay good money for if you went to Jenny Craig or whomever else it is that was going to help you lose those 30 pounds. Look, with that, these have been wonderful questions. You've done a beautiful job of guiding us. Thank you. Thanks for tolerating sort of lengthy answers because, again, there are very few simple responses or simple answer to complex questions. They tend to require comprehensive analyses and solutions. But thanks again also just sitting through all of this. My goodness, it's very kind of you as a fellow strategic leader here, but to loan us your campus and to work so closely with the World Affairs Council here in Miami. It is great to be back in this great part of our country. Thank you.
Thank you, General. That concludes our session. We have some coffee and snacks outside. We all appreciate you for coming, and for those of you who served, thank you for your service. General, thank you.
Privilege.